Hey guys, this is Ron. So in this tutorial, we're going to talk a little bit about command line arguments. So in your program, you might want to be able to specify additional functionalities on the command line when they call your program. So for instance, we have ls right here, which gives us a listing of each of the files within our directory. But if we do a ls-l, we get a different output altogether. This is the long listing that gives us additional information. And all we had to do was specify this extra command line argument to get that functionality. So we want to add that type of functionality, let's say, to our greeting program. So our greeting program was a real simple program we wrote early on in the tutorial that really just asked the user what their name was and then greeted them. So real simple program. So we can do /greeting. It asks me what my name is, and then it prints out a greeting, right? Well, what if we wanted to specify a name on the command line? Well, there's no mechanism right now to allow for that. So it's going to ignore whatever I put in here. So whatever. It just completely ignores it. It doesn't use that whatsoever. What happens if the user wanted to get some help on what the program does and how they interact with it? Again, it completely ignores those arguments, and so the user is left. They have to run the program in order to figure it out. So instead, we again want to add some command line arguments to it. So I'll bring up Genie here. I've got the greeting program fired up, and just to kind of walk through it again, real simple. It checks first to see if it's running as main, which it is because we're calling it with Python. It calls the main method. The main method prompts the user for some input. That input is passed to the send greeting function right here, and it does a print. Okay, and so there's no consideration for a command line argument being made here. So let's go ahead and create a new file from template main.py. We'll get rid of all these comments here. And so what we notice here is, although the overall layout looks very similar to what we had in greeting, we have a couple of extra things here. First of all, we're importing sys, and then we're doing a sys.exit here, and we're doing a sys.argv. So we'll ignore sys.exit because what the functionality that we really care about is built into sys.argv. So argv is going to contain all the command line arguments that we pass it. And notice that those command line arguments are getting passed to main. And so they end up here as args. So if we come down here and just print args, we'll save this. My projects, Python tutorial, call this greeting 2. Alright, so we're going to print args 2. So if I come minimize that, I'll do ls chmod. So I'm just going to add execution to my greeting 2. Now I'll do a /greeting2.py. This time it prints out a list, because notice the square brackets. And inside of that list, all I have is the name of the file that was called. Okay? Now if I specify additional things in here, we get those in the list as well. So again, the first argument always is the file name. And then additionally, we get each of the items that were passed on the command line. And again, these are just looking at the spaces in between them. So this is the first argument, second argument, third argument, right? But again, they always start after the file name itself. So we can use this functionality then within our program. So I bring Genie back up. I'll go to my greeting program. I will copy out my greeting function. We'll copy out my call to that function. Alright, but instead of user input, I'm going to pass it args 1. Alright, because again, 0 is the first index of the list, and that first index is always the file name. So 1 is the second item, and that is going to be that first command line argument. So here, if I pass it Ron, here I get the functionality that I want. Nice to meet you, Ron. Okay. So again, this is the functionality we wanted. We want to be able to pass the name on the command line and have that immediately put in. However, what if the user's a little confused as to what they're supposed to be passing? They're used to running command line programs, so the -- help is something they're used to seeing. Well, that doesn't quite work, because here this is sys.argv. It is the first item, or actually the index 1, and so it just again interprets that as, well, that's what you wanted to be sent, so I put that in this function. So again, it doesn't, even though we have the ability to use command line arguments, they don't have the ability to use some of these help mechanisms that they're used to. So in order to do that, we're going to either have to build in additional logic checking within our program, or we can use a different module altogether. And so for this case, we'll use a completely different module. So I'll go ahead and import arg parse. All right, so arg parse is going to allow us to specify some command line arguments and build kind of a better, more polished program here. So the first thing I'm going to do is build a parser. All right, so parser equals arg parse dot argument parser. I'm going to specify a description equals, and here I'm just going to basically specify this is what my program does. So this program greets you. All right. Now I'm going to add some command line arguments. So in my parser, I'm going to do a parser.add underscore argument. And here I'm going to specify what those arguments look like. And so there's a lot of different things I can add here. So in our case, we're going to be adding a name to be greeted. So maybe a -n makes sense. So when the user types in greeting2.py -n space Ron, it's going to interpret Ron as the name and go ahead and utilize that. Well, maybe they're used to using longer names. So -n is the short name, --name is the long name, right? So again, the user could use either one of those, right? And so here we're going to do a type equals string. So whatever they pass, we're going to interpret that as a string. There's an action to be performed. So here we have a couple of different options. In our case, we're just going to do a store. And store is basically going to say, hey, whatever is passed as that argument, we're going to store it in a variable to be used later. And if we don't specify a name in here, or a destination, it's going to use this --name, this long name, and it will create a variable for that. And so our value will get stored in there, which is what we're going to do. Now, additionally, I could have done an action of store true. So if they specify -n, I'm saying, well, since that's present, well, then the value of this will be true. If they never specify -n on the command line, I'm going to store a value of false, right? So I'm just looking for the presence of -n, okay? There's an additional one called count. And here I can think of maybe we're looking at an output. And so the user can specify -v for verbose. But they can also specify -vv. So now I'm going to count the number of V's that are in there, right? And so now I have a higher count. I know the user wants it to be a more verbose output. And then maybe it's a -vvv for a very, very verbose output. So some programs operate in that manner, and so your action equals count probably makes more sense for that. And then lastly, we have append. So append you can use to build a list of different values that they end up sending you. So in our case, again, we'll just use store because it makes sense to, hey, if they specify -n or --name, whatever follows that, we're going to store it in a variable called name. Okay? We'll do a required equals true. And so what this basically specifies is that they have to specify a -n or a --name. If they don't, our program's going to have problems, and we want to know that right away. So this is a required value, and so we'll see what that looks like later. And then lastly, we'll give them a little bit of help, right? So help, we'll specify here, please, we'll just do specify a user name. Something to that effect, right? So now we've added our arguments. And so now we want to pull those arguments back out so that we can use them. So as the user passes them in, we're going to store a variable. We already have args that was sys.argv. We'll call this just args2 equals parser dot parse underscore args. Now I understand this looks like parse space args. There actually is an underscore in there for whatever reason. Genie today has decided not to have those show up. So whatever. But understand that there is an underscore there and there is an underscore there. Alright. So now let's go ahead and utilize it. So let's do a send underscore greeting, and we'll pass it args2 dot name. And so basically this is the arguments that get pulled back out, right? And then dot name is in reference to here. So whatever the user specifies after -n or --name, it will get stored in name. That's retrieved here and passed up to our greeting. So assuming that I have not made any typos, which is a big assumption, let's go ahead and check it out. So if I do a /greetings2.py, hopefully I can specify a -n and run, and it works. Wonderful. So -n gets interpreted as the name. That name ends up getting passed to the send greeting function, and boom, we get the functionality we want. But what we were also going for is how do we give the user a little bit of help? So if I do a /greetings2 again, this time I specify help. Look at this. I already have a nice menu that I didn't necessarily have to build myself, but argparse helps me out with it. So it specifies, well, this is the usage, right? So you're going to do greeting2. You have the option of asking for help, which is what I did here, except I used --help. Notice it's also down here. That is in brackets because it is not required, but what is required is at least the name, right? So -n and the name, the --name and the name, and then here's the little help that I gave it, specify username, and here's the description that I gave it. So it tends to build a nicer menu that will explain to the user, this is how you utilize my program, this is what my program does for you, here's a description of each of the command line arguments in order for you to interact with it. Alright, so let's do a /greeting2.py, and what we should see is that there's an error because -n or --name is required, because we specified and said, hey, you're required to enter this. So again, it'll help the user figure out, okay, yep, I'm forgetting to add something on the command line here, or something to that effect. So I hope you see where argparse is a lot nicer when it comes to building these menus and stuff like that. It is a little bit of a pain to work with to get it up and functioning the way you want it to. There's a whole lot more that you have to do than just using sys.argv. But again, to have this kind of functionality in your program, it kind of makes sense when you're going to be handing that over to somebody else to be used, and they might not have the insight into how your program functions, so they'll get confused from time to time. So having a help menu makes a whole lot of sense. So hope you got something out of this tutorial. Again, it'll help you write some nicer pieces of software, and thank you for watching.